Hello, this is Dr. Llewellyn Eisen, and this is the first of two lectures for our unit on Christian monasticism. So, our goals for this unit are to consider the historical and philosophical inheritance of Christian monasticism, and to consider the various types of monastic movements that will emerge just prior to and after the legalization of Christianity. So, of course, as you know, I'm going to ask you to learn some language here. And the vocabulary term that you need to know for this unit is ascesis. This is a word that comes from the Greek, and it is a word that emerges within language around athletics. And it is a word that means training or practice or discipline. So an ascetic is someone who trains, who practices, or who is disciplined. So I will probably refer to monastic figures as ascetics, but it's important to keep in mind while all monks should be ascetics, not all ascetics are monks. And while many ascetics are monks, not all monks are ascetic. Okay, so the monastic movement within Christianity doesn't, of course, come out of nothing, and Christianity does not invent monasticism. So the ascetic strain within late antiquity, the era in which Christianity will emerge, is something that's already part of the culture. As I mentioned, it is language that emerges within vocabulary and writings about athletics. So in ancient athletics, one's intent was to train the body and then control the outcome. This took some pretty extreme forms, and a lot of it has to do with how bodily fluids and functions are meant to operate within an individual. So, for example, in our contemporary culture, sexual activity is very often seen as a sign of power, as a sign of strength. But in the classical period and in antiquity, it's almost the opposite. Refraining from sexual activity was a sign of courage, of power, and of strength. And so refusing to allow the semen, or what was considered the life force, from leaving the body was thought to make a man more powerful and more strong. We can see this in the language of Artemidorus, in which he writes, "He dreamed he cut off his genitals, bound his head, and was crowned as a victor. As long as he remained a virgin, his athletic career was brilliant and distinguished, but once he began to have sexual intercourse, he ended his career ingloriously." So in this case, you can see that by engaging in sexual activity, by releasing semen, power that is held within the body and used for athletic activity is now lost. Okay. By late antiquity, bodily forms of ascetic behavior and characteristics, ascetic characteristics, are a part of not just the athletic life, but also the philosophical life. And asceticism in time is noted as a religious exercise, and frugality is considered a religious virtue. So we also need to think about the ascetic inheritance of the philosophical world. In part, this has to do with a deep suspicion of the body, which we find later among many, but not all, Christian Gnostic groups. And the philosophical world will hold a deep suspicion of the body, and will view the body as the container of the true self being, of course, the spirit. The philosophical world will encourage minimal sleep, minimal food, minimal pleasures, and in fact, certain natural functions will be derided. As Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher, wrote, it is a mark of an ungifted man to spend a great deal of time in what concerns his body. Much exercise, much eating, much drinking, much evacuating of the bowels, much copulating. These are to be done in passing. Let your whole attention be devoted to the mind. Okay, so here moderation is being encouraged as and promoted as the proper behavior of a sensible, civilized person. Okay. Additionally, we have also to consider Roman society itself, and the role that the power of the father played in Roman life. Remember that at the head of every family is a pater or mater, but mostly a pater familias, the head of every family. And the patria potestas, the father had power over that particular family unit. And this was something that was restricting and challenging for women who wished not to be part of that system. Additionally, even though there are not monastic groups within Judaism, we have the ascetic inheritance of the Essenes. And remember, the Essenes were an ascetic group that withdrew from Jerusalem, believing that the temple had been violated, and set up an alternative society outside of the city. We don't know that it was a completely male community, but that is suspected. It is also suspected that John the Baptist was an Essene because of references to how he dressed, his time in the desert, and his diet. And because we know that Jesus was both a follower of John the Baptist and also related to John the Baptist, we, of course, can know that there was some degree of influence on the person of Jesus by the Essenes. And so we see this influence in some of the language of Jesus that is used by the gospel authors. Lynch refers to what he calls the hard sayings of Jesus in this chapter 16. And so let's just take a look at some of those right now. In Matthew 4, 1 through 2, verses 1 and 2, we read about Jesus' time in meditation in the desert, and that he was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. I love that they mention that he was famished. Now, we don't know that 40 days and 40 nights of fasting means that he ate nothing, but again, we know that fasting is the regulation of a diet. We can assume that it was minimal, obviously minimal enough to be hungry. We also read in some of the hard sayings that opulence, you owning everything, is not really of an advantage of a Christian. Then someone said, "Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life?" And Jesus said, "If you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments." And that person said, "Which ones?" And Jesus said, "You shall not murder, or commit adultery, or steal, don't bear false witness, honor your father and mother, and love your neighbor as yourself." The young man said, "I've kept all these things. What do I still lack?" And Jesus said, "If you wish to be perfect, go and sell your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me." When the young man heard this word, he went away grieving, for he had many possessions. Now, a lot of times people talk about this passage as if the young man is lost. Now, it doesn't say that the young man did not do those things. We don't know. Maybe he did. The point of the passage is that he went away grieving, that it's hard to do that, right? That this is a difficult thing to do. It's hard to be detached from the things that you own. And so maybe this was an impediment to a life that would have been better for this young man's eternal life. Okay, that's a hard saying. Other hard sayings include this one. Jesus said to them, "Not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can." So, eunuchs are individuals whose genitalia either have been removed surgically or did not descend properly during puberty, or perhaps were born, or perhaps those individuals were born with anomalous genitalia. So eunuchs perform an important role in government in the classical world and late antiquity, all the way through the Byzantine period. Eunuchs are unique individuals. The Romans had a difficult time with the role of the eunuch. They did not believe, I mean, they didn't have any problem importing eunuchs, but they did not believe in the creating of eunuchs. And so this is a passage that appears to be promoting the role of the eunuchs and that of chastity. And some Christians are going to take this rather literally, as we learn in the account of Origen. And I don't know that we can take Origen's account literally, considering he promoted allegorical readings. Additionally, we learn of the ascetic inheritance in the letters of Paul, who writes that I chastise my body and bring it into subjection, lest perhaps when I have preached to others, I myself should be cast away. Here, Paul is assuring his readers that he's not asking them to do anything that he himself is not also doing, right? So he's leading by example in being vigilant in attending to behaviors of the body. Additionally, in the second letter to the Corinthians, which is, according to some biblical scholars, not a Pauline letter, nevertheless, the author writes, "But we have this treasure in clay jars," referring to the spirit, the treasure being the spirit of the human and the clay jar being the flesh, so that it may be clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. Whoever wrote it, it's a beautiful passage. The notion of our bodies as clay jars, as frail items, but that within them there is something that is stronger and less frail. In the earliest decades after the Jesus movement, we find in the apostolic authors this notion that the renunciation of the needs of the body are going to imbue one with authority. With Marcion, remember we met Marcion, our lovely friend Marcion, writing that those who neither married nor were given in marriage were equal to the angels. So this notion that those who remain apart from the social norm of a marital unit are living a type of life that would be considered angelic. And this is a theme about monastic life that will continue. We find also in apocryphal texts, including some of the ones that we've read, the Acts of Thecla, that blessed are those who keep the flesh pure, for they shall become the temple of God. Blessed are those who remain continent, meaning keeping away from sexual activity, for to them shall God speak. Blessed are those who have wives as if they had them not, for they shall inherit God. So having wife as if one has them not means one is married but not engaging in sexual activity. Blessed are the bodies of virgins, for they shall be well pleasing to God and shall not lose the reward of their purity. So this is language we've already encountered in all these ways by, meeting the Essenes, in the sayings of Jesus, in some of the ethical behaviors we saw Jesus engage in the activity of Paul, in the activity of Marcion, especially his views about matter, and in the activity of Tekla. We also see this attitude about renunciation and asceticism within martyr accounts. Certainly Perpetua and Felicitas not caring for their physical comfort, even as they, had some benefits. But here is a paragraph from a martyr account that we didn't read, the martyr of Polycarp, who was an elderly bishop, and he, in this account, replied, "You threaten with a fire that burns for an hour, and after a short while is extinguished, for you do not know about the fire of the coming judgment and eternal torment reserved for the ungodly. But why are you waiting? Bring on what you wish." So it's a nice challenge, this elderly Polycarp is giving to the Roman authorities, and they light him on fire and bake him like a fragrant loaf of bread. So by the time we get to the centuries in which Christianity has been legalized, this notion of asceticism as being part and parcel of Christian theology is certainly there. The theology of Evagrius the Solitary sums this up really quite beautifully, that self-control is the soul's salvation, for it shows the way to enlightenment and leads to the kingdom of heaven. So this is seen as the highest ethical activity for a Christian. And it doesn't have to be, a Christian within a monastic community. We're going to see what that looks like. But this is, activity in which any Christian in any household can participate. So just to summarize, monasticism and the monastic movement within Christianity, we will see, will be inspired by the physical training of the athlete or the soldier, the philosophy of both Romans and Greeks, the behavior of the Vestal Virgins, one that I didn't talk about specifically here, but one which we've already been introduced to. Imperial Puritanism that actually is very popular in the first century, by the activity of the Essenes, by Jesus' hard sayings, by the promotion of chastity and endurance by Paul, and of course the suffering of the Jewish wars that we were introduced to in the second week of class. Monasticism is also inspired by apostolic authors who promote chastity as a value, by both the activity of martyrdom and inspired by its elimination as well. And then, of course, by the imperial Christian landscape, which we're going to turn to here in a minute. For many Christians, the enveloping of Christianity, the legalization of Christianity by the imperial landscape is going to be a natural conclusion to what was set in motion when, according to the gospel account, Caesar Augustus sent everyone home to be counted. That the emperor has a role to play in the advancement of Christianity, even if they don't know it, was demonstrated, according to the gospel authors, from the beginning. But for others, the enveloping of Christianity by the imperial landscape is going to be untenable. For them, asceticism and the focus it required and the status that it brought was the appropriate method of resistance to a world in which they could no longer prove their Christianity with their life. So we will turn to those modes and methods in our second lecture. But before we get to that second lecture, let's finish this one. So remember that with the embracing of Christianity by the Roman Empire, it's going to look radically different. With the emperor as the high patron now, money is infused into the religion, and that means that the landscape will change. Part of that landscape is not just, the organization of things like monastic communities, but also part of that organization is the distribution of goods and services and worship sites. Prior to Constantine, remember, the architecture of Christianity, the container of worship, was fairly humble. The churches, there were churches, they did exist, there were buildings, but they were not elaborate and they were not really artistically spectacular. They had, of course, their own beauty, but it was a different kind of beauty. It was not ostentatious. Prior to Constantine, the structures were intimate and fairly small. Post Constantine, they were pretty dramatic and quite large. Here is another example of a post-Constantine building. This was one of the first Christian churches in Rome. It was actually a set of imperial apartments that were donated to Christianity and then turned into a church. So let's deal with our homework questions. According to Lynch, how did the rise of asceticism and the institution of monasticism influence the basic idea of what it meant to be a Christian and what it meant to be a Christian leader? So in terms of this first point, for a Christian, asceticism was largely unregulated and therefore allowed an individual Christian to practice their own ascetic behavior of their choice in a way that was very independent. Now, for some Christian communities, this is going to be, considerably problematic because some communities will want to control and regulate and make asceticism dependent on the church. This is always that struggle that you'll have between the individual and the institution. The bottom line, most important thing to remember here is that ascetic behaviors are behaviors that people can practice on their own in the privacy of their own home. And so this changed really what it meant to be an individual Christian, where you weren't required to be, part of some sort of organization in order to engage in these ascetic practices. In terms of being a Christian leader, because there was such high esteem held of ascetics, they were believed to have access to the Holy Spirit and to be able to, they were considered very wise, they were considered great healers, and they were considered great leaders. Because of this, in time, it is expected that Christian leaders will be ascetics, and Christian leaders who are not ascetics will be viewed with suspicion by many. And we see this today. I mean, under Pope Benedict, the previous pope, there was a great deal of financial scandals that were starting to come out. And in fact, Pope Francis, one of the first things he did was clean house with a lot of these bishops and archbishops and cardinals who were in no way demonstrating the type of fidelity to poverty that would be expected of a Christian leader. According to Lynch, how did asceticism and the institution of monasticism provide opportunity for liberation for men and most especially for women? Well, we've kind of been talking about this all the way through ever since we were introduced to some of the first female Christians that we've encountered. This religion provided access to autonomous behaviors and autonomous ways of life. And asceticism, and in time, the institution of monasticism, will also allow opportunity or provide opportunity for people, men and women, to operate independent of society's social systems that were expected of most people: marriage, children, certain occupations. Monasticism provided the opportunity to move beyond what the state and one's family expected of a person. If you have questions, feel free to email me at isenbl@plu.edu, and we will consider monastic models and modes in our second lecture on this unit of the Rise of Christian Monasticism.